Hello. This video is going to cover Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and particularly how that ties to ongoing themes that we've been discussing with human nature. But also with this last week, I wanted to draw your reflection, your thought onto your relationship to the rest of the world, right? What does a reflection of human nature mean for how you should act in the world, if you should at all? And to that end, there's going to be two views that are in tension that are expressed this last week. This video is going to cover Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, as stated earlier, but the other video is going to cover Taoism. And we're going to see some very different ideas about where human activity and human nature plays in the lives we live with each other. So to that end, we'll move on to the letter. So the letter, as you can see in what was selected, was written in 1963 and was written by Martin Luther King in jail in Birmingham, hence the title. And he wrote this letter because he was essentially denounced by 8 very respectable Christian and Jewish leaders in the South, basically saying, hey, these protests, these marches, this nonviolent direct action, which at that time was considered to be sparking violence, right? That things are kind of fine. Then King comes down and starts disturbing all this dust and all this conflict and all this stuff in the air, which is a problem. Like the South hasn't had a chance to adapt and react to Brown versus Board, which made segregation illegal in 1954. So this is years later, and there's still a segregation, right? And so King is coming down there to say, hey, we're going to force you all to do this essentially with our presence, with breaking laws and all these things. And this is where you see all the conflict and the classic images of the protest, right? And so from that end, we want to look at, well, what is King arguing and how can this be connected to themes of human nature and perhaps ethical obligations that we have towards each other and the world, because you all will likely be taking ethics next after this class. So we'll start with, we aren't going to start with the part where he's describing non-violent direct action. We'll get to that. But we're actually going to start with his talk about the impact of oppression, which is later, and his idea of just and unjust laws, because those are going to relate directly to how we understand human nature. So the first thing is the question of oppression. And what does oppression do to you when you're an oppressor or you participate in oppression and when you are oppressed, right? So oftentimes when we understand oppression, we talk about it in purely moral terms, as in one person's a good person and one person's a bad person, right? The oppressor is the bad person and the oppressed are the good people and that, right? But it's not really that simple, right? And the people who engage in oppression are not necessarily purely benefiting from this, right, situation, especially from King's perspective, right? And this relates to kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier with Lewis Gordon's emphasis on the idea that racism is primarily, or well, not necessarily primarily, but it has a political dimension to it in addition to a moral one, right? So it's not just about who's the good person, who's the bad person, who deserves to have what they have, and who doesn't deserve to have what they have, and what's fair and what's not fair. It's also about how political institutions um, maintain imbalances of power and how those imbalances of power affect the entire political infrastructure of a country, right? And King's going to talk about this a bit about what makes a law just or unjust. He's going to refer to the political situation, right? But to get to that, we can also say that there's a mention of how we understand our humanity and how our humanity develops and matures. So one of the things that's really important is this essay, this letter is released as part of a book called Why We Can't Wait. Because that's the main thing that King is pushing back against, and the main thing that people are telling us, like, slow down, relax, just wait. wait for us to the South to adapt to the changes. Wait for it's going to take time. Like this is segregation, slavery, all these things have been around for centuries. You're not going to undo that in one day because the courts decided to change the law, right? Remember, this is Brown versus Board decided in 1954. King is writing this in 1963, right? So there's already been a decent amount of time. But people are saying, hey, slow down. Like you're causing a lot of tension. You're going to make things worse. You're going to block progress because people need time to adapt. And so King tries to deal with this by arguing about what oppression does to people. So we'll talk about the oppressed person. The biggest threat, the biggest damage to a person who's oppressed, King argues, is to their dignity, to their sense of self. And the argument, therefore, is that essential part of being human is a sense of dignity, which is a sense of value, being a human. Humans need more than just material things like food and water and shelter. They also need to have a sense that they matter, that they're important. And perhaps this value is as crucial and sometimes even more so than the material ones, right? There's a sociologist, Peter Berger, who says that every human needs something to live for. And consequently, that's also what they're willing to die for, right? That whatever animates you, that makes you want to live, that you care most about, is often the thing that you're most willing to sacrifice your own life for. And that's important because there's an argument then that there's something about the human that needs way more than just material satisfaction, right? That will end our material life for the sake of something that we value. So it could be love, it could be nation, it could be an ideal or an idea or something like that. But we need something more than material satisfaction because we'll happily give up our lives for these higher ideals, this higher purpose, higher meaning, right? And oppression erodes that in the person who's oppressed. In the letter he calls it somebodyness, right? Feeling like I am important, like I matter, like I'm a person, right? This is personhood, right? King is talking about being a human is one thing. That might just be a biological phenomenon, but being a person is a moral, ethical, and for him, spiritual status. That oppression erodes, it cuts down. You start to feel like you don't matter. You start to feel like you're not important. And he says if oppression isn't changed, the person can begin to accept their oppression. They can begin to feel like, well, I deserve this. I should live in these conditions. I shouldn't improve or change myself and others. If I look around and I see that no one cares about me and where I live, well, why should I change or do anything? Right? And you actually see this very often in many situations where people are very marginalized, as in pushed to the margins, different neighborhoods that are very run down and don't have good resources and other things like that. People often say, like, why should I care about this place? No one else does. So why should I be the one to care? Right? Well, that's more than just a person abandoning responsibility, right, for themselves and their environment. It's a wound to their humanity. It comes from a wound to their sense of self, to their soul, King would argue, right? That they've been oppressed and restricted such that the damage that's been dealt to them has blocked them from doing what humans normally do, which is to move in the world and try to act with a sense of value, right? And so he says that's one reason why we can't wait, because the more we wait, the more people are going to lose their vitality and lose their willingness to challenge something that is wrong, right? But there's also damage to those who are oppressing. And this is where King talks about his disappointment in what he calls the white moderate, right? Which is someone who's not the extreme racist that we mostly think of as the main antagonist in the anti-segregation movement. He says, I'm beginning to think that maybe it's not the the explicit Ku Klux Klan members that's the biggest threat to our movement, but the white moderate who, quote, he says, believes he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, right? What does he mean by that? is that there's a profound lack of empathy, right? That for me, if I'm the moderate person who feels comfortable and secure and all these things in the world, the thing I don't like is tension. The thing I don't like is a lot of disturbances, right? But I'm actually fine with people suffering. I'm actually fine with people not actualizing their full potential as humans. I'm actually fine with people feeling like they don't matter. What I'm not fine with is my own life being disturbed, right? And so for King and the moderates he's most concerned about are Christians, right? You understand he's writing this letter to other Christians. He's like, you're the ones who are the followers of Jesus Christ, the person who died for the sake of a higher love, who died to cleanse humanity of sinfulness, right? And yet you're saying you're okay with other people suffering and dying. Other people, and by death, I mean not just literally being killed as people were, but also slowly as in their sense of humanity eroding away. And another thing that's important to remember is that most of the black people who are being segregated against are Christians. So it's also Christians being completely okay with their fellow Christians suffering and feeling like they don't matter. And so King is wondering, how does this make sense? Where is the space for this higher ideal of love, right? In the Christian framework, humans by nature are sinful, we're fallen, right? Well, not every Christian framework, but from the dominant one. And we need God's grace to help us achieve our potential, which is generally discussed as a certain kind of love, a capacity to love. But King is saying that because you are in an oppressor category, you've benefited so long from these people being marginalized, despised, killed, blocked off, all that kind of stuff like that. You're suffering a wound too in empathy. You can't live up to your own ideals. You can't feel what it's like, right? He says, for the people who tell us not to wait, I mean, people are telling us to wait. You don't know the pressure of your daughter telling you when she's 6, why am I ugly? Right? There's no reason a 6-year-old should have those kinds of thoughts. But you're beginning to see, it's like King is like, I'm seeing in real time how my daughter's sense of humanity is eroding, right? And that gives me a sense of urgency. I can't wait, right? But the very fact that you can't see that you can't feel that, is telling me that you're suffering a wound too. That the oppression has blocked off a certain part of your core humanity, which is empathy, which is the ability to feel for others, right? Which is to be able to live towards ideals, right? Which we've talked about. This valuing, this mattering. Al-Shariati talks about this as well. Rousseau talks about this as well, right? We're supposed to live towards ideals and increasingly make our lives better. But in this situation, that part is damaged. The ideals, he says, the ideals you claim to hold, such as truth and love and justice, you're completely incapable of living up to them because you've benefited so much from people's oppression. So there's a double damage to the humanity. The humanity oppressor is damaged, and the humanity oppressed is damaged. Right? One is being forced to be blocked from doing so, the person we call the oppressed. And the other person, by working so hard to negate another person's humanity, limits their own human possibilities. I can't live up to my ideals of love. I can't live up to my ideas of democracy. I can't live up to my ideas of justice because that would mean the people I need to siphon resources and energy from would have more power. And I can't have moral courage to say, hey, that's wrong. We should change that. So for King, being human fundamentally has a moral and value dimension to it. And when we can't genuinely act from that because of a situation or context, then we're not achieving our human potential. We're not actualizing ourselves the way we're supposed to be. right? So that's the first part. The second part concerns a long American tradition called civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is when someone breaks a law because they want to show that they value the overall system. And essentially that a law is against the spirit of the country or the legal system, and therefore it should be broken, should be violated, to draw attention to the fact that it's wrong. That's why it's civil disobedience, right? It's when we learn about civics, right? Our political system, our legal system has a certain type of spirit behind it, or ethos, or intent, or or perspective. And there can be laws, these people argue, that go against that, right? For instance, our country is democratic. So the idea there's a certain type of philosophy or worldview that says, hey, people should have power and should be able to vote and influence society. Now, laws that are passed that block people from participating in democracy, someone might argue, are against the spirit of the country or spirit of our legal system, which is supposed to protect people's human rights. When we talk about liberalism, right? The law is supposed to arbitrate and protect and manage conflicts between people's different rights and things like that, right? But if a law explicitly just violates someone's rights or law or or prospects, someone could argue that law is just wrong, right? And therefore it should be broken. So civil disobedience intentionally breaks laws to draw attention to the fact that the law is wrong. Now, one important thing, this is why King is in jail, is that if you do civil disobedience, you have to accept the consequences of breaking the law, right? He's in, he went to jail because, for instance, there's a lot of reasons why, but one is, for example, when they went to protest, they couldn't get permits, right? They wanted to have a normal protest or a march, and they go to Birmingham and say, hey, okay, we want a permit so we can protest the fact that segregation isn't being taken away as fast as it should be, right? It's been a while, right? And we want a permit so we can march. And the city said, no, we're not going to give you one. So King and other people said, we're going to march anyway. Now we're breaking the law. That's why the police come out. That's why the fire hoses and the dogs come out. It's not because people hated the protesting so much that these people are just protesting and then the police just attack them, right? It was because they were technically breaking the law, right? So, to that end, one thing that's related to human nature is King's notion of just and unjust laws. Now, there are some laws that are good independent of whether or not they're legal, and some laws are bad independent of whether or not they're legal, right? King wants to make a distinction between something being morally correct and being legal. He says, remember, everything the Nazis did was legal and everything the resistance fighters did was illegal, right? So he wants to say that there's a higher level of justification for making a law good or bad. It's not just that some people get together and pass a law, or a king or a priest or something like that, right? There's a higher level law. And so, drawing from Aquinas, he takes his notion of natural law and some laws being just and others being unjust. So, what makes a law just? It's not the fact that it's not the power of the person who passed it, but there's two ways that you can understand natural law. One is that, coming from a Christian perspective, which Aquinas certainly was, is that God has ordained certain things to be good. And we have evidence in the Bible and Revelation, all these other things, right? And laws that further that goodness are good. And laws that block that are bad. No matter what the political situation is. And this is where you can see debates right now in terms of in the United States with between different Christian right-wing groups and other groups of people about certain laws, because it doesn't matter if there's some type of political will, right? People might argue that some things are just wrong because they go against what God wants, right? So certain laws shouldn't exist or shouldn't be passed, right? Now, King is much more, when he's talking about the natural law, he's not really concerned about certain things like abortion or things with sexuality and gender as we've kind of it's become dominated. He's talking about a fundamental dehumanization of people. And he says there's no law that facilitates that should be allowed, right? So there's a central statement that the purpose of law is to advance and support the development of humans, right? But it's very different than many people might think about law, right? So law's purpose is not just justice, but to facilitate the growth and development of human potential. And for him, that comes a lot from God. But now there's a couple other ones. The other one is that are there natural human needs and wants and desires that are just good in a sense they should be fulfilled? For example, people shouldn't go hungry. It's a bad thing for people to be hungry, to be starving. Therefore, any laws that are passed that facilitate starving are bad, right? Or any law that allows torture, for instance. Someone could say any law that supports torture is bad because torture is just wrong because it's too painful on the human body. That's when the question is to what extent are the features of this human existence proper foundations for legal distinctions? People have all kinds of different positions on this, but King wants to argue that there's something about human dignity and human suffering that the law should be sensitive to, right? So those are the two main points about this notion of natural law and just and unjust laws. One, that there's a certain way that God intended us to live together, and laws should facilitate that. They should work with that. The other is that there are certain human goods that humans should have and experience because we suffer without them, and the law should facilitate that as well. From a civil disobedience perspective, any law that violates either of those goods can be broken because they undermine the ultimate spirit of the law. The second thing, there's a third point which is more democratic, where he says that basically black people didn't have a proper say in making the laws. Therefore, the laws are illegitimate. Like they didn't get a fair vote or a fair chance to make their voice heard because of the blocks to voting and other things like that. Therefore, the laws are illegitimate. But we're going to focus on that. That's a little more political philosophy. We're going to focus on that a bit less. So those are some of the main takeaway points is that if, to return to this, is that when those, King is asking in this question to the moderate, do we have a special obligation to those who are suffering, to those who are oppressed, especially if we're oppressing them, right? And King will say yes, because it violates our human nature and theirs for them not to be able to live as free as possible, right? And so I want you to think about this in terms of as you think about what makes a human, what matters about being a human to you, right? Are there then special obligations to preserve that in other people? As in, if someone's having that violated in them, do we have a special obligation to act? Does a view of human nature entail a certain type of ethical orientation? King would say 100% yes, but not necessarily the case. I want to know what you think. Right? If you feel like perfectibility, as Rousseau talked about, is an important part of human nature, us being able to improve the world. Well, what if someone's being blocked from that unfairly? In the case of Janet Armstrong with sustainability, if you believe that if you find that very interesting, that you feel that being a human involves a certain relationship to the nature and the environment, and the ability to take responsibility for it and cultivate it. But what if someone's being unfairly blocked from that? Do we have an obligation to change that? Right. So these are things I want you to think about the text is very rich and there's a lot more to say in it. The letter from Birmingham jail. I didn't even get to the stuff about the nonviolent direct action, all that stuff, just because I don't want this video to go on for a long, long, long time. You could talk about a lot of different things, but I just wanted to wrap up with this question of, for you walk with this question of, now that you're developing your view on what it means to be human and what matters most to being human, the next step is, well, what kind of action should we take to protect that? What kind of laws should we be passing or not passing to protect that? What kind of political movements or things should we be doing or not doing, right? What kind of social life should we be having to facilitate that? And you see around you, many whatever the different places you're all from, people have created a world to facilitate their what they understand as what's best for humanity. But as a philosophy class, I want you to think about what that means for you. Until we talk again.